I'm delighted to be joined in on the phone today by Mr. George Fitzgerald from Dublin. And George, you're involved in a new documentary called The Dublin Behind the History, and there's also a Waterford connection. So maybe we should start off first with, tell us a little bit about Dublin Behind the History and your own involvement in it, please.
Well, the reason I done it was because partially somewhere the working class Dublin history sort of can be hidden right behind 1960 and 1922. And it was a horrific time for working class people in the tenements. It was branded as the worst slums in Europe, and you also had a thing called the Monto, which is Montgomery Street, which was the biggest brothel in Europe at that particular time. And so I became very interested in the story, and of course it sent me in different directions as I researched. I then found that in the 1840s Dublin was filled with a lot of children that would have come from different parts of the country. So I started to investigate, where did these kids come from? They were wandering the streets of Dublin often during the famine time. So obviously then I went and looked at the closest cities, the biggest cities, and I seen that in Waterford at that particular time there was over, I think it was 25% of the population was decreasing, and there was evidence that they went from Waterford to Dublin in the hope of sailing to Liverpool. So in that, I also understood that not every one of them would have made it to Liverpool. So hence, a lot of these kids would have ended up wandering the streets of Dublin, sort of in a sense like a massive version of Oliver Twist.
And so you say this first came to light, or you first heard about it when you were researching it about Dublin, and I was only reading the little bit that was here, and so it would seem that like that as times became more desperate down around the countryside, that people were sort of naturally gravitating towards the city in the hope of getting into a poorhouse or getting some work or getting something. So and was it mostly orphans that came from Waterford? Was it the fact that their parents had died and they had nobody else to look after them and nowhere to go?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, because right across the country, in a sense, when the famine really hit, it was over in the west. The main part was the west, and they would have left for the 5 Points in New York, South Boston, and probably San Francisco. But they would have been people with money, because they could have afforded to actually get on the coffin ships and go. But the poorest of the poorest, probably speaking their native language, which would have been Gaelic Irish, they would have made their way on foot to Dublin. And this would have also included people from Waterford, around that part of Ireland. They would have made their way to Dublin also. But the workhouse in Waterford, the Waterford House of Industry was right beside, connected to an asylum in 1799. Then the Waterford Poor Laws in 1839. The workhouse was then built in 1839 to 40 by George Wilkinson on a 6-acre land southeast of South Hill in the city. So before the famine, it's obvious when you look at what was going on here, even in Waterford, there was already a problem with the poor. As in Dublin, as in most parts of the country, it wasn't only the famine. We already had a problem with poverty. So when the famine came, it was the final blow, wasn't it?
Well, it does sound like it, because I have heard before that Waterford was actually a sort of a centre for the export of food during the times of famine. So, I mean, even though there would have been a lot of people living in the city, they wouldn't have had a lot of access to the food that was actually in the city or passing through the city. So are you seeing this as a common thread where, say, basically the poor were excluded from any chance of surviving during the famine, and then were excluded from history due to it never been written about?
Yeah, well, it has been documented. Of course, it has been documented. But the thing is that there's a popular conception out there in our modern world of Dublin 2016 that if you ask most people about the famine, they'll always sort of interject towards, well, it happened in the west of Ireland. But in actual fact, it didn't. It arrived in Waterford in 1845. The famine did affect Waterford, and you're right in saying that Waterford was one of the places where a lot of the food sources was leaving the island towards Britain. And obviously, like in every society, there must have been some sort of segregation between there was a philosophy there between the British also, that it was deemed that these people who were impoverished was basically their own fault. They were criminalising them because of the fact that they were poor. But in reality, it was a circumstantial situation that caused them to find themselves in that place at the time.
And do you think then that the Irish government or the Irish country or Irish historians have since then done justice to these poor people who were, who were very much outside of society and ostracized, and like you're saying, made to. Well, what you're saying is that they were made to feel as if their own fault they were poor. Do you think all that has a bearing on why we don't know much about them today?
Yeah, possibly, because at the end of the day, if your concepts or philosophies, again, history, who wrote it? Who wrote the history and who told the stories? And if people were of that mindset, they would have told the history according to their own philosophies and their own way of thinking at that particular time, branding people almost criminal because of the fact that you are impoverished. Now, this wasn't even only in Waterford. This was a broad sense of the thinking behind it, the people that were in government, and also connected to people that were in government, that if you're impoverished, it was your own fault. They designed the workhouse. They designed it in a way that it was very uncomfortable. It wasn't designed in any workhouse. They were called, more or less, they were called the Union. In Dublin, you had the South Dublin Union, the North Dublin Union. But these buildings and these institutions were actually designed so that they'd be very, very uncomfortable, so that people wouldn't stay in them. Because then they thought that if they stayed in them, then they'd become people that were dependent more so on the state and how the state would feed them. So they weren't even comfortable establishments for these people. They were horrific places, really. It was a horrific time. And within the country. And then within Dublin, at that time you had the Act of Union. The Act of Union took place in 1801. The gentry fled and abandoned all the Georgian houses, and then it was taken over by the corporation, and the government were involved. And what happened then was they were breaking them down and using them as a house was for one family. It was now broken down and redeveloped to house 10 families. And between 1845, obviously, you had people, as the country's population decreased, Dublin's increased. So you had people coming from all over the country, walking into Dublin barefooted probably, trying to look for a fever hospital or a workhouse, ending up in the tenements, which then became branded as Dublin having the worst slums in Europe amidst the biggest brothel in Europe.
So, George, where can you see this going? Because I can see, judging by, I've been to school, I learned the Irish history, I heard about Trevelyan's corn and the pig farmers of Ballybricken and the food still being exported from here and places like that, and variations of the famine. And I never heard this one before about people, that hungry that they would go to the bigger cities in the hope of doing so. So this is you're only scratching the surface and you're only beginning to make it public. Where do you see and where do you hope to see it going from here, your research and the work that you're doing and the outcome of your work, the results of your work?
Well, I'm not finished yet, and I do hope that it gets viewership. It's on YouTube, and you can see it on YouTube. It's called Dublin Behind the History, and I hope it sort of re-educates people's minds also in the fact that what the working class people survived across the country, regardless what county they came from, Waterford, Galway, or whatever it was in Dublin, what they actually overcame. You had in the tenements at that time, it was rampant with consumption. And people were dying, not only one singular person, but actually families were being wiped out by consumption. And also, it was a rat-infested, terrible place. The vermin were so big, some people said they were like cats. You had horrific stuff going on, but these people endured it and they overcame it. And it's nearly, in a sense, what I'm trying to say is that we need to applaud the people from whatever county you're from, whatever part of the world. Working class people need to be applauded for the obstacles that they overcame to reach 2016, because there's been many attacks on their lives between sicknesses and diseases that didn't touch the middle class people.
And do you think that that's more of a general theme, like you were saying before, and there's a huge element of truth to it. History is always written by the winner, and of course, why wouldn't it be? So, but the working class, what you seem to be saying to me is the working class and the poor are never going to be the winners, because there's always going to be a working class or a poor or an underbelly, and they're always going to suffer the brunt of what society has to offer, and they're never going to have their story told because they're never going to be the winners. And you're trying to sort of redress that.
Exactly. I'm trying to bring about the reality of what took place in our society in which we lived. Like, the poor can't be forgotten. The hero isn't somebody that won a seat within a political situation, but a person that grew up in the morning, fought consumption, fought a rat-infested place, fought crime and brought his family up to live respectfully in the worst slums in Europe. Do you know what I mean? These were the successful people. These were the people that actually built the city. And eventually what they did was, during the famine years, they ended up going, of course, to the 5 Points in New York, which was the most notorious ghetto slum in American history. And it was predominantly an Irish neighbourhood. And they were absolutely treated terrible there. They were actually savagery in themselves in their behaviour. But eventually, like every Irishman, whatever country we went to, whatever working class, they overcame. They overcame. And they became respectable members of society. And this is the whole purpose of what the documentary is really about. And also, on the sort of religious concept, you had a thing called the Monto, Montgomery Street in Dublin. At any given night between 1845 and 1923, there was up to 1,600 prostitutes walking the Monto. Now, the majority of these prostitutes that were walking the Monto were all country girls. They weren't Dublin. Most of them were from the country, which would have been Waterford and all these type of country places where they came to Dublin looking for work, but they were enticed down into the Monto, and before they knew where they were working for the madams who ran the tip houses. And then they ended up having babies, which was known as the Monto babies. So these Monto babies were born on the streets. And it was a horrific place. But eventually, what happened there was that a fella called Frank Duff, he seen a woman die. And he picked up a cross and he marched on the Monto and he nailed the cross up onto the highest point of Foley Street in Dublin. And the Monto began to crash. He brought down the biggest brothel in Europe with a moral code of upright stand. He understood justice and he understood the point that this is not right. The government's not doing anything about it. We need to do something about it. And they went and did something about it. And they brought it down through a moral code. The moral code of goodness, of righteousness and of peace overcame the biggest brothel in Europe.
And do you think
in our society, I think we need to see someone else doing very similar.
Well, this is what I was just about to say. It seems to be there would seem to be a lot of quietness because of all this, because of perhaps the shame that a lot of people had to go through, because of the desperation that they had to go through. So you have the losers, as in these poor unfortunate people coming to Dublin to try and live, who were never going to write their own history and probably didn't want their story told. But do you see parallels with today, and what do you think we can do about it? Because you're striking a chord here in the sense that it's very much human nature. It's very much desperate times. Desperate people do desperate things. Poor people will always come out worst. The winners or the controllers of society will always write the history, and the losers or the sloggers or the people with the shame or the people who had to go through the hardship are always airbrushed or written out or sort of dismissed. What do you think this says about us, and where can we go from here? What can we do to rectify this?
I think we said, if you look at it, there's a common denominator here within our society and particularly within Dublin, as we see what's making the headlines all the time, is that if you look at it clearly, the majority of crime and stuff that takes place is taking place within particular working class neighbourhoods. And if it's acceptable, more or less, that working class neighbourhoods produce these type of people, and it's unacceptable where upper class neighbourhoods would produce these type of characters. The common denominator here is education. And if society doesn't accept an educated person committing a crime at a level of a working class person would do, well then the obvious answer is education. So the obvious answer is this, is that catch the next generation and educate the next generation. Because if you don't educate the next generation, we'll wake up at 75, 60 or 80 years of age, old men and women in our beds in a society that's completely and utterly unruly. Because look what we've seen. Morally we've decayed. Technicality we've advanced. But morally we've decayed. Over the last four or five decades, it's gone to a place of horrificness nearly, where it's actually acceptable today that these crimes are being committed in our city and in our country. Murder in Ireland is nearly per day. And we can't allow that to go on. But the common denominator and the core to change all that, I believe, is educate people. Educate them and put a vision in front of them. Let them understand the importance of education, and the vision that's in front of them will cause them to walk towards the goal that's ahead of them.
Well, George, I must say the hairs are standing on the back of my neck here, because I think you're speaking about something that is very much relevant today, tomorrow, yesterday, and 150 years ago. What's the name of the clip on YouTube?
It's called The Dublin Behind the History, Part 1 and 2.
And you have two of them up. Do you plan to do more?
Yeah, well, I'm looking at one at the moment, and what I'm looking at is it's based on. I open it with I open part one with a book I've written. I've written a few books, and the book is called The Secret Life of Ashley Brown, and it's her story how she gets involved in drugs and all that. But she becomes aware of the tenement story also because she's doing a bit of investigate. It's a long story to get through that point. But what I'm looking at the moment is actually the industrial skills. What went on in the industrial skills, and go down there and dig up the graves and see what actually went on within the industrial skills and why were they sent to the industrial skills. A lot of kids from Dublin would have been sent there for like grabbing a slice of bread.
Receiving arms, I believe.
Were sent to these places that some people actually said was our own personal Holocaust.
Well, I'll tell you, George, we're only scratching the top of the surface, and if you don't mind, I'm going to have to call it a day for today. But I would love to catch up with you again. I hope you continue your work, and perhaps you might, we'll stay in touch because I'd like to get a copy maybe of some of your other books, and maybe we could have a chat about them, if you're up for it.
I'll have that book, should have that book out soon, and when I have it ready to go, I'll email you and I'll send you a copy of it.
Perfect. Can't say fair enough. Listen, Mr. George Fitzgerald, thank you very much. The video it's on YouTube, and if you put in the Dublin Behind the History, and there's part 1 and part 2. George, we'll be talking again. It was a privilege and an honour to talk to you. You sound like a remarkably sensible, dedicated, enthusiastic, fair man, and we hope to talk to you again soon. Good luck in your endeavours.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thanks very much.